Hi, I'm Tyler Foltz. I'm a nuclear engineer with a little over 10 years of experience in the commercial nuclear power industry. From engineering to operations to emergency response. I don't claim to know everything there is to know nuclear, but I can certainly share some knowledge. Please join me on a journey to a clean energy future by liking, commenting, and subscribing. Today we're going to be looking at another one of Kurzgesagt's videos called Is Civilization on the Brink of Collapse? I'm going to say no. This is one of those questions that seems to come up from time to time during times of crises, but if you look throughout history, the answer has always been no, at least on a global scale. Individual nation states, empires have risen and fallen, sure, but if you look at human civilization as a collective, I would say even now we're probably more resistant to collapse than we've ever been in history, just with our advanced technology, all the lessons we've learned in the past from other big threats like plagues, pandemics, and I know there's the whole nuclear war thing and global climate change thing that has been brought on by technology, but the nuclear war thing is a little overrated. Kurzgesagt actually did a video on even if we detonated all the nukes at once, that still wouldn't completely wipe us out. And most civilizations, yeah, some of them rise and fall over time, but yeah, I don't think we're at any higher risk of collapse than we ever really have been throughout history. But let's see what Kurzgesagt has to say.
At its height, the Roman Empire was home to about 30% of the world's population, and in many ways, it was the pinnacle of human advancement. Its citizens enjoyed the benefits of central heating, concrete, double glazing, banking, international trade, and upward social mobility. Rome became the first.
They also had plumbing, using lead-based pipes that gave people lead poisoning. Okay.
In history with 1 million inhabitants, and was a center of technological, legal, and economic progress. An empire impossible to topple, stable and rich and powerful. Until it wasn't anymore. First slowly, then suddenly, the most powerful civilization on Earth collapsed. By civilization, we mean a complex society where labor is specialized and social classes emerge, and which is ruled by institutions. Civilizations share a dominant mutual language and culture, and domesticate plants and animals to feed and sustain large cities, where they often construct impressive monuments. Civilization lets us become efficient on large scales, collect vast amounts of knowledge, and put human ingenuity and the natural resources of the world to work. Without civilization, most people would never have been born, which makes it a bit concerning that collapse is the rule, not the exception. Virtually all civilizations end, on average, after 340 years. Collapse is rarely.
So they're talking about individual nation states, empires, what have you. Sure, that happens, and yeah, everything changes flags, but I thought they were going to get into the whole like world-ending collapse that humanity would never recover from. Let's keep going.
Is for individuals. Their shared cultural identity is shattered as institutions lose the power to organize people. Knowledge is lost, living standards fall, violence increases, and often the population declines. The civilization either completely disappears, is absorbed by stronger neighbors, or something new emerges, sometimes with more primitive technology than before. If this is
interesting, in the case of Rome, they took a civilization, the Greeks, and like more or less copied a lot of their religion and stuff. It's kind of this interesting thing where they took it, absorbed it, and kind of turned into it. Fascinating.
How it's been over the ages, what about us today? Just as Europeans forgot how to build indoor plumbing and make cement, will we lose our industrial technology And with that, our greatest achievements, from $1 pizza to smartphones or laser eye surgery, will all this go away too? Today, our cities stretch for thousands of square kilometers. We travel the skies. Our communication is instant. Industrial agriculture with engineered high-yield plants, efficient machinery and high-potency fertilizer feeds billions of people. Modern medicine gives us the longest lifespan we've ever had, while industrial technology gives us an unprecedented level of comfort and abundance, even though we haven't yet learned to attain them without destroying our ecosphere. There are arguably still...
I know what they're getting at. We have. It's just a matter of will and using the right generation sources like nuclear power.
Different civilizations around today that compete and coexist with each other, but together they also form a singular global civilization.
Yep.
But this modern globalized civilization is even more vulnerable in some ways than past empires because we are much more deeply interconnected. A collapse of the industrialized world literally means that the majority of people alive today would perish, since without
I'm going to challenge that assertion. While we're more connected, we can also help each other out more. So I would say there might be some things, again, using the pandemic as an example of everyone traveling to and from each other more, but I would say we're more willing to help each other out just by being able to respond faster. Not saying everyone cooperates on everything all at once, but we do have that capability to do so. So you could argue for some things that we might be a bit more vulnerable, but we're also of that much more able to help each other out than we were even 30 years ago. Example, you could say what they did in 2016 with Chernobyl. It was an international coalition, not just Ukraine, not just former Soviet bloc, that built this new safe confinement structure over the remnant of the sarcophagus they built back in the 1980s, and this thing could last for upwards of 100 years. So, and that was all done with a big European coalition. So we can definitely pull our resources together.
Industrial agriculture, we would no longer be able to feed them. And there's an even greater risk. What if a collapse was so deeply destructive that we were unable to re-industrialize again? What if it ruined our chances of enjoying a flourishing future as a multiplanetary species?
That thing is still possible, but I would say we're less likely to take a hit of whatever thing that brings us to pre-industrial levels than we were, say, in the 1800s when industrialization wasn't very common and record-keeping of that sort of thing wasn't very common, or at least as accessible as it is today.
Civilizational collapse could be an existential catastrophe, something that ruins not just the lives of everyone alive today, but all the future generations that could have come into being. All the knowledge we might have discovered, the art we might have created, the joys we might have experienced would be lost. So, how likely is all of this? Let's start with some good news. While civilization collapses have happened regularly, none have ever derailed the course of global civilization. Rome collapsed, but the Aksumite Empire, or the Teotihuacans, and of course the Byzantine Empire, carried on. What about sudden population crashes?
Not to mention in the case of Rome, kingdoms, the Ostrogoths, the Visigoths, the Franks, all those kingdoms rose. No, they weren't as advanced, but it's still a matter of yin and yang, of one falling giving rise to another.
So far, we've not seen a catastrophe that has killed much more than 10% of the global population. No pandemic, no natural disaster, no war. The last clear example of a rapid global population decrease was the Black Death, a pandemic of the bubonic plague in the 14th century that spread across the Middle East and Europe and killed a third of all Europeans and about 1/10 of the global population. If any event was going to cause the collapse of civilization, that should have been it. But even the Black Death demonstrates humanity's resilience more than its fragility. While the old societies were massively disrupted in the short term, the intense loss of human lives and suffering did little to negatively impact European economic and technological development in the long run. population size recovered within 2 centuries, and just 2 centuries later, the Industrial Revolution began. History is full of incredible recoveries from horrible tragedies. Take the atomic bombing of Hiroshima during World War II. 104.
Okay, yes, that was a powerful weapon and a tragedy, but to put that in the same league as the Black Death, no. We're talking on the order of tens of thousands to a little over 100,000 people in this attack.
3,000 people were killed, and 90% of the city was at least partially incinerated or reduced to rubble. But against all odds, they made a remarkable recovery. Hiroshima's population recovered within a decade, and today it's a thriving city of 1.2 million people. None of this made these horrible...
One other thing I'll add is the actual war itself did a lot more destruction to Japan as a whole, Germany, Russia, all these countries that participated, and it's... I see what they did there with using the atomic bomb as an example of rapid recovery, but this isn't... that was never close to anything civilization ending.
And any less horrible for those who lived through them. But for us as a species, these signs of resilience are good news. Wide recovery is likely even in the worst case. One thing that's different from historic collapses is that humanity now has unprecedented destructive power. Today's nuclear arsenals are so powerful that all-out global war could cause a nuclear winter and billions of deaths. Our knowledge of our own biology and...
Nuclear winter, it is difficult to estimate the effects accurately for that. That would depend on a few factors, such as where the bombs actually detonated. Let's say the vast majority of them would be in the northern hemisphere. The southern hemisphere would be less affected by that, by all that ash being kicked up into the air. In fact, it's entirely possible that countries like Australia would be largely unaffected directly in the event of an all-out nuclear exchange. But now we're getting into the odds of that even happening are super, super low, and even if it did, we're not... I think a lot of it's again, controversial to really look at the effects, because you have to deal with, we're talking simultaneous ones, urban detonations, depends on the location of the city and how much ash it would actually kick up. That's the real deadly aspect they're talking about, not the actual the individual fireballs or even the radiation leaking from them, the fallout. But this one's a little bit more out there than most people realize it is.
To manipulate it is getting so advanced that it's becoming possible to engineer viruses as contagious as the coronavirus and as deadly as Ebola. Increasingly, the risk of global pandemics is much higher than in the past. So we may cause a collapse ourselves, and it might be much worse than the things nature has thrown at us so far. But if, say, 99% of the population...
I know they were just going for visual, but now they were showing a bunch of nuclear detonations that would actually heat up the planet, even though it would really... They just talked about the threat of cooling it off. It would take a lot more nukes than we currently have to do something like that. Maybe there's a reference to Battlestar Galactica or something when the Cylons just destroyed planets by nuking them into submission with an arsenal millions and millions of times larger than ours. But I just thought I'd point that out.
Would global civilization collapse forever? Could we recover from such a tragedy? We have some reasons to be optimistic. Let's start with food. There are 1 billion agricultural workers today, so even if the global population fell to just 80 million, it's virtually guaranteed that many survivors would know how to produce food. And we don't need to start at square one, because we could still use modern high-yield crops. Maize is 10 times bigger.
One other thing that we're less vulnerable to a food-related thing now is we just have the technology to move things further distances and grow them in multiple spots. We have that sort of diverse, redundant food sources where one entire empire isn't dependent on, say, like in the case of ancient Egypt, the flood patterns of the Nile, for instance. We got a lot more things that we don't have to worry about one single point failure anymore.
Its wild ancestor. Ancient tomatoes were the size of today's peas. After agriculture, the next step towards recovery would be rebuilding industrial capacity like power grids and automated manufacturing. A huge problem.
And if this happens, we actually have a great opportunity to use large-scale nuclear power, wind power, solar power. We don't necessarily need to go back to coal and gas anymore. I think I mentioned in a previous video, wouldn't it be cool if the Industrial Revolution actually just started with nuclear and renewables back in the 1700s and 1800s, and this whole coal, natural gas thing was never much of a thing. Things would have turned out a lot different, I'm sure, and I'm sure there's other consequences I'm not thinking of right now, but it's just an interesting idea. Let me know what you think of that one in the comments.
Is that our economies of scale make it impossible to just pick up where we left off. Many of our high-tech industries are only functional because of huge demand and intensely interconnected supply chains across different continents. Even if our infrastructure were left unharmed, we would make huge steps backwards technologically. But then again, we are thinking in larger timeframes. Industrialization originally happened 12,000 years after the agricultural revolution. So if we need to start over after a massive collapse, it shouldn't be that hard to reindustrialize, at least on evolutionary timescales. There's a hitch though. The Industrial Revolution was fueled literally by burning easily accessible coal, and we are still very much reliant on it. If we use it all up today, aside from making rapid climate change much worse, we could hinder our ability to recover from a huge crisis. So we should stop using.
Yeah, there's a bit of a fallacy there with the whole proved reserves. There's a saying with oil, for instance, peak oil is always 20 years away, kind of like nuclear fusion, but on a different note. And that's because we keep finding more and more reserves. So the idea of us actually running out of resources, this is a bit of a separate topic, but I don't think we're going to run out of resources anytime soon.
Easy to access coal, so it can serve as a civilization insurance in case something bad happens. Another thing that makes recovery likely is that we probably have most of the information we need to rebuild civilization.
Yes. That's the
we would
key one.
certainly lose a lot of crucial institutional knowledge, especially on hard drives that nobody could read or operate anymore. But a lot of the technological, scientific, and cultural knowledge stored in the world's 2.6 million libraries would survive the catastrophe. The post-collapse survivors would know what used to be possible, and they could reverse engineer some of the tools and machines they'd find. In conclusion, despite the bleak prospect of catastrophic threats, natural or created by ourselves, there is reason for optimism. Humankind is remarkably resilient, and even in the case of a global civilizational collapse, it seems likely that we would be able to recover, even if many people were to perish or suffer immense hardship, even if we lost cultural and technological achievements in the process. But given the stakes, the risks are still unnervingly high. Nuclear war and dangerous pandemics threaten the amazing global civilization.
I always go after nuclear war with this one. Yeah, I'll come back to that.
We have built. Humanity is like a teenager, speeding around blind corners, drunk without a seatbelt. The good news is that it's still early enough to prepare for and to mitigate these risks. We just need to actually do it. We made this video together with Will MacAskill, a professor of philosophy at Oxford and one of the founders of the effective altruism movement, which is about doing the most good you can with your time and money. Will just published a new book called What We Owe the Future, which is about how you can positively impact the long-term future of our world. If you like Kurzgesagt videos, the chances are high you'll like it. The book has some pretty counterintuitive arguments, like that risks from new technologies such as AI and synthetic biology are at least as grave as those from climate change, or that the world doesn't contain too many people, but too few, and especially that everyday actions like recycling or refusing to fly just aren't that big a deal compared to where you donate or what career you pursue. Most importantly, it argues that by acting wisely, you can help make tomorrow better than today, and how we together can build a flourishing world for the thousands or millions of generations that will come after us. Many things we at Kurzgesagt talk about regularly are discussed here in much greater detail. Check out What We Owe the Future wherever you get your books or audiobooks.
It's a cool idea. I like it when they bring in, points of view that are less common. Again, the whole nuclear, they always have to bring up the high risk of nuclear war. And I mean, it's more of the high impact of, obviously no one wants to see the horrific effects of a war on that scale. But if you look at how few wars we've had since nuclear weapons have been a thing, and yes, people are still threatening and wars still occur, but things haven't really gotten any worse despite nuclear weapons being fairly old at this point. Also, the amount of nuclear weapons in the world is declining with disarmament and various treaties in place. The peak, I've done a video on this before, in terms of nuclear weapons based on declassified documents, was actually back in the 1960s. And the amount of detonations would still be bad, but again, the impact nuclear winter, probably an exaggeration, and the risk of that is actually going down as people continue to disarm their weapon systems. So that risk is going down over time. Anyway, what did you guys think of this? Are we at brink of collapse? I would say no. And if we had even minor to even severe collapses, we would recover far faster than it took our civilization to initially find and develop the technologies. But I don't see it happening, at least not anytime soon. Thank you very much for watching. I'll see you next time.